Howdy folks, Rudros here and welcome to another Lorcana Wednesday. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps the channel out and lets me move forward with all the wonderful plans I've got for it. So this week I wanted to bring you a deck that I'd been brewing for a while, and this is actually the deck my girlfriend runs for just kind of in general, but she ran it for the set championships this last weekend. Her and I both went to the same one, and we ended up in the top 8 overall. I actually made it all the way to top 4 before I lost in a Ruby Amethyst mirror match, but she won with this deck. Also, I had some people asking about budget decks recently on the channel, and I thought this would be a good chance to show this one off. So this is a pretty cheap deck you can run, assuming these numbers on Dreamborn are to be believed. You can see this one's only about $81, and the most expensive card is the Queen's Castle down here, which is about $8.44 a piece. You could easily substitute that with something like the Library. Library should only be about 27 cents. So if you knock that off, that's $32. This is going to get down to about a $50 deck. Yeah, the Mim Fox is going to be the next best one in there, and you know, there's a few pieces you could substitute as well. I think you would be very unwise to not run the Fox, but I do think you could do Library in place of the Queen's Castle, even though I think Queen's Castle is superior. But hey, if you're just trying to save some money, why not? So the whole purpose of this deck, this is very different than most of the green-purple decks you will see from this set. If you look at the events page for some of these decks, if you were to go to Las Vegas, there is a very popular, well, actually, let's go to the one in Birmingham, because I believe that one had a big showing there. Is it up here? No. Well, that's okay. We'll show Vegas. So there is a essentially mid-range version of this deck, is what I've called it running around. It uses both the big Clarabelles, it uses the big Ursula. Some of them run some of these songs. But it definitely has this mid-range feel to it. It can go aggressive with some merfolk, but it is very powerful in the mid-range style. Well, we wanted to do a deck that was just very aggressive and put on a lot of early pressure, so this is the version we decided on. And the entire concept of the deck was designed around when you're playing against something like, let's say, red-blue, or a deck that has good control power, you can usually get to about 14 ink with some early lore pressure. Sorry, 14 lore. And then the deck can potentially fizzle out if your opponent is able to stabilize. And what we found testing against red-blue is usually 14, 15 lore is about the point opponent would stabilize, and suddenly no matter what you put down, they just remove it instantly. So that's where you need to get very cheesy and cheese out a bunch of lore. So how do we cheese out a bunch of lore? Well, you've got, of course, your 4 goats. You have 4 copies of Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, and 4 copies of the Bosses on a Roll. So when you cast Bosses on a Roll, this is 1 single lore by itself, plus it lets you manipulate the next 5 cards of your deck. You can put them on the top or bottom in any order of your choice. So often what she'll do is, let's say she's on 17 lore, she casts this, she gains 1 for it, and then she'll just find the next Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, put it all the way to the top of the deck. And then you can use cards like the Amethyst Chromicron to just immediately draw into that card and get going. As you've noticed, this is a bit unconventional. We don't have a card like Friends on the other side, because I found we had so much card draw with the Chromicon that we simply just didn't need it. And you're okay giving your opponents cards because, again, you're just trying to cheese out a win. If you were to see all of your instant lore cards, so let's say you saw all 4 Goat plus all 4 of Boss and Gathering Knowledge. If you see all 4 of these, that's 8 lore. All 4 goats, that's minimum 8 lore. That's 16. All 4 bosses, that's 20. So you could theoretically get to 20 lore in this deck without ever questing. Now, that's not going to happen because you're going to be questing your butt off with your 1-drops. Turn 1, it is absolutely imperative you find a 1-drop, preferably Curse Merfolk. Maybe once you're in a matchup and you see that maybe they can deal with Merfolk easily, Pegasus can be pretty useful simply because he's evasive. So if they clear a lot of your characters through challenging, Pegasus can be a good answer to that. Being able to shift onto the big Pegasus can also be very, very brutal when you do that on turn 4. Or sorry, turn 3, so you can go like Merfolk turn 1, Pegasus Merfolk turn 2, boom, shift into big Pegasus. Now they're all evasive as well. Can put on insane pressure. And then we have 2 Chernobogs, mainly just here for card draw. There's not really a better lore quester. We could have put in the 1-drop Maleficent, but we're overall trying to keep our uninkable count very low. There's 12 in here. And I'll talk about some of the little tech changes you can make as well. So a lot of this you're probably familiar with purple. I'm not really going to talk about the Merlin Mim package. You should know all of these. I'll only touch that there's only 2 Rabbit. 1 to keep uninkable low, and 2, we're trying to go fast and we're trying to cheese. And Rabbit on its own on turn 4 isn't exactly a quick play. So there's just enough in here to make it useful, but we didn't want to bog down on it. The new Bonsai is fantastic. I think this card is overall a 100% upgrade over this Flynn Rider, other than the fact it's uninkable. And I asked her if she wanted, we could switch to a full 4 of the Bonsai instead of this 2-2 split. However, it never really seemed to hurt her, and she still really appreciated the low uninkable count. So instead of going up to 14, we decided to keep the split. And I never saw her be like, oh no, I'm stuck with Flynn. If anything, she would often ink the Flynn on 2 and then put the Bonsai out. There is a lot of teching for red removal in this deck. Red removal is currently all about taking out characters with a certain strength value. So cards like Sisu, the 3-cost uninkable one, the big 8-drop one, the Medusa, they all hit cards that have 2 or less strength, or in Medusa's case, 3 or less strength. But a Bonsai this early, what's great about him versus Flynn, yes, Flynn's going to make them discard, but Bonsai will almost always kill anything that challenges him that early. I can't think of a commonly used card that can challenge Bonsai early and survive. There's not very many. Plus he quests for 2 lore. Yeah, they both cost 2, both quest for 2, both have 2 health. So the only difference is he is going to punish something that has to challenge him. And that was kind of the interesting thing about constructing this deck is all of the changes and choices we made improved her matchups into the red deck. So if you are in a locals or in an area where there's a lot of red decks, I think these choices are really going to help you out. If you're against Steel, Steel continues to be kind of the bane of this deck's existence, and Steel is not going to make a difference here, right? They both have 2 health. They're both going to die to a Storm Rage on. So we noticed that it didn't really change much against Steel, which is a bit unfortunate, but it did improve the red matchups. And I had people face this Bonsai in turn 2 in a red deck, and he's like, well, I had the Brawl, but, you know, I can't use it on the Bonsai. So I think if you're doing this personally, if you're willing to take the higher uninkable, I would actually get rid of the 2 Flynn and do a full 4 Bonsai. But if you want to keep it on the lower side, you can keep a split like this as well. Ursula, Fox, Crab are all pretty standard, so I'll talk about Hey Hey next. Talk about more of these tech options. The reason we liked Hey Hey is, again, a testing against blue-red, which is very common, or even blue-gray. Almost always you're going to be behind on ink in that deck, whether you've gone first or second, because they're usually going to ramp. And so it was nice to put a card down that not only threatened to quest for 2, but actually helped you ramp up a little bit as well. So if you put this down on 3, suddenly you can go into a 5-drop on the next turn, or a 2 and a 3-drop. Instead of being forced into, well, I just have to do a 4-drop as well. He also quests for 2 lore, and that was a big part of designing this. Remember, we want to go fast, and we want to then cheese out the victory if we can't get there naturally. So it is important to have as many high lore questers as possible, and I'll touch on that again in the end. So we thought Hey Hey fit that slot well. Cloud Kicker is a card that I've debated cutting here and there. He comes in use. He's useful just enough that he keeps staying in the deck, especially if you're going first. Let's say you have an ideal, you know, triple Merfolk opening, or Merfolk, Pegasus Merfolk, or maybe even Merfolk into Bonsai. You've got a lot of pressure, and the only way they're not drawing their spot removal, so they're trying to defeat your characters through a challenge, and Kit just resetting that and giving you a whole extra turn can feel very good. So, but there's also other decks where if they play like a Captain Smee or their own Fox or Crab or Snake, Kit can't hit those cards. So in those matchups, he doesn't feel as good, but at least you can ink him. Don Carnage. So remember earlier I talked about beating up on the red decks. So the whole point of him is, the idea was that when you get to that point, because you can get 1 to 10 lore, 1 to 14 lore pretty reliably, right? But what do you do when you get to that destabilization point, when your deck starts to fall apart, and that is when the blue deck is completely set up and is ready to take over, or maybe Steel Song's just 100% doing what it's going to do? Well, if you're in top deck mode, top decking a Pegasus and a Don Carnage, what's the difference? They have the same cost, they have the same lore value. Don Carnage has a better stat line than Pegasus. Pegasus is better specifically for the shift line, but if you're top deck and trying to get a victory and you just need a character to throw out there, you'd rather throw out Don Carnage over Pegasus. So we've tried a 2-2 split. Don Carnage will not die to a Medusa or a Sisu. They're going to have to use an ice block on him to get him there, whereas Pegasus is naturally in that range. So understand that that's why Don Carnage and similarly Meg are in here. They are simply for the idea that you're in trouble, you're going to pull a card off the top of your deck, you need a lot of lore, and you want it to survive. These cards are going to have a much better chance for surviving. Same with Megara. There's no Hercules. It's just because she has Ward. She's a 5-cost inkable that has Ward. And since she has Ward, it means barring very, very specific circumstances like a Be King Undisputed or 2 Grab Your Sword, she's going to guarantee get 2 lore out of a single quest because she has Ward, so they can't target her. all in service to taking on that matchup. Those are the characters. Knowledge and Wisdom, very simple. Play it, gain 2 lore. And with the Chromicons, you're going to speed your way to that, so you can cheese out a lot of victories. Same with the Bosses on a Roll. I really like this card in here. It has ultimately replaced Friends on the other side, as the instant lore gain is very nice. No one really runs this card either, so you can usually catch players off guard with it. It's also a song, so it can be sung by your foxes or your rabbits or any of your characters that are 3 or more. And when you're in that desperation mode, when you're like, man, I just need to find the next thing. I just need to find the next thing that lets me win the game. You can look, all right, there's the Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom. Let me put it right on top of the deck. Pop it with the Chromicon. Instantly cast it. Very good. Chromicon, this is your card draw. This card is great in decks that can cheese out wins. You do not want to use this in fair decks because giving your opponent a bunch of cards is not a good idea. But in decks where you're trying to cheese a win, guess what? It doesn't matter how many cards they have in hand if your only goal is to get to the next Gathering Knowledge and then win. Or your only goal is to get to the next Goat and then win. They can have 100 cards in hand. It's not going to stop that. You're Welcome is a really nice bit of spot removal. You can use it on your own cards. That's not really recommended, but you can do fun things like sing it with your own rabbit, target your own rabbit. It'll make him leave the field, so you draw 2 cards from the You're Welcome and 1 from the rabbit. If for some reason you're an 18 lore with a single goat on field, or like you can quest with the goat and then pay to use it on the goat to send him back into the deck if you don't have another way to get rid of it. That's kind of a last resort. It's mainly in here as spot removal against your opponent if they have some dangerous card that you just must absolutely get rid of. A Tamatoa, you don't really want to be challenging into a Tamatoa in this deck, or some location they have McDuck Manor or their own Queen's Castle, something that you just can't handle and you absolutely must get rid of it. You're Welcome is good spot removal for that, but as it does draw them cards, you don't want to do it willy-nilly. Touched on the Chromicon, and finally Queen's Castle. Still just the best location I think there is in the game. If you can put this out on turn 4, especially if you're going first and you have Merfolk and Bonsai, maybe a shifted Big Pegasus, you've just put out so many threats that, especially going first, there's just no decks that can really answer all that. They're going to have to either address your characters or your location. And if you play it anytime, you know what Queen's Castle can do when it's sitting around. So this is the theme of the deck. You just want to go quick. Again, it's cheap. It's a nice budget version. You're trying to win fast, but unlike some aggro decks where they just completely run out of steam, you get as far as you can on lore, and then you use all your cheesy methods, whether it's Goat, Knowledge and Wisdom, or Bosses on a Roll to close the game out. And the Chromicons will keep feeding ink to you. What's nice, too, is a previous version of this deck we did before the Chromicon came out, we never really wanted to go past 5 ink, as we don't have the big Ursula. We don't have the Clarabelle. We don't have these big high-cost cards to get to. But since you have so many cards with the Chromicon now, you can keep inking and get to those high levels of ink, which, yes, you don't have some big bomb to play, but if you're able to do a Goat and bounce in the same turn, this deck couldn't always do that the way we ran it before. Talking about some tech choices, I looked through Emerald and Amethyst and was looking for any card that just had 2 lore, and again, the whole point is to avoid the red removal, right? Because most of it also doesn't avoid the steel removal. Merlin looked okay, and he does have an entry effect. Archimedes is evasive, but again, he's going to die to Sisu. Dies to Sisu. Stone Earth Giant's really not terrible, but it gives your opponent a card, but maybe you don't care about that with the Chromicons anyway, so he could be worth looking at. Gale would be great if they only are going to challenge it, but any steel deck's going to be able to get rid of this lickety-split, as will all the red decks, so he doesn't fit our game plan. Uninkable, dies to the red, too costly and uninkable, dies to red, dies to red, dies to red. I mean, not terrible if you want an attacker. Yeah, so many of these cards die to the red removal. Bell would be okay. I think you could actually consider the Bell. Dolores, not terrible, but again, will die to a Medusa if it comes down. Dies to Medusa. Yeah, so you can see, looking at all these cards, there's a few of them that wouldn't die to a Medusa, which was the point we're trying to avoid, but we're also trying to get inkable and doesn't die to a Medusa. Not a whole lot of great options for that, so I was pretty pleased with what I put in there. I actually think the Zazu could be okay. It's kind of better than Don Carnage in the sense that it's better against steel, but it dies to the Medusa, which the Don Carnage does not. So you could find any of these little techs. Again, Jacques used to see play, I think, last set, but look at that stat line. He's going to die to any bits of those red removal. So we've been very happy with the success of this specifically avoiding the red removal. If you've got ideas to avoid more steel removal, please let me know, because steel does still give this deck a lot of fits. And I just don't think it exists right now. I just couldn't really find the cards, at least that quested for a lot, that were good against steel, but also still fast enough. So if you've got ideas, I'd love to hear them. Anyway, this is a deck I would highly recommend you try it out. Again, she got to top 8 with it this past weekend. She was actually 1 game away from top 4 as well, and she ended up losing to the Gray Emerald Steel discard deck. But she took a game off of it, and she was so close to getting that second game. So I think it's very fun. Again, swap Castle for Library if you need an even cheaper option. I do think Fox is pretty essential in this. Let me know what you think. Good luck at your set championships on these continuing weekends, and we will be heading toward the Azurite Sea sooner than later. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I appreciate you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.